I just want to share that there's an expression that says, heart work is hard work. And so as we have been looking around it and feeling all of the things out in the world right now that have to do with racism, I want to remind you that this information that has to do with Juneteenth is reflective of heart work in understanding that is hard work. So Juneteenth is a holiday that many people celebrate now around the United States, and it is one that I have struggled with for a long time because I don't consider it a celebratory day. It's a difficult day for me. And so I want to give you a little bit of information about the history behind Juneteenth so that you can understand where I'm coming from. There are two Independence Days in the United States. One is the one that you know, it's a federal holiday. And the other one is one that I would say defies the history of the other by its very existence. And it teaches us a lesson about silence as a moral act of complicity. That holiday is Juneteenth. Now, to get the point of this talk, I need to provide you with an updated history lesson, probably very different than the books that you read when you were a child. From 1619, when the very first slave ships came and landed from the coast of Africa to Jamestown, Virginia, to when soldiers arrived in Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, slaves were used to build what is now known as the United States. Juneteenth recognizes the day when a Union general, General Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, with an announcement that slaves were free. That proclamation freed slaves that were rebelling against the United States, where the government had no authority to free slaves. It was just not in Lincoln's jurisdiction. In the areas where the U.S. had jurisdiction, had the authority to free the slaves, the border states, and the areas of the Confederacy that had been taken over by the Union, those slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln didn't free the slaves that he actually had the authority to free. The North, or people call it the Union, fought against the South, or people call it the Confederacy, over the issue of slavery. And some people say that the war had nothing to do with slavery. Modern-day historians will tell you it had everything to do with slavery. And the North won. And just by might, it's understandable because the North had 22 million troops versus the South, which had 9 million troops, 3.5 of which were slaves. And I would imagine that those slaves didn't have a vested interest in the Confederacy winning because the Confederacy wanted slavery. Many slaves in the South, in fact, began coming over to the Union side. And the Union, because the slaves were the enemies, the slaves were a resource for the enemies, they didn't want to let go of them. And so when the slaves came over to the Union side, the Union didn't want to give them back. In fact, so many slaves escaped to the North that it then became necessary for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because technically the Confederate masters owned those slaves as their property, and for the Union to continue to harbor those slaves meant that they were doing something illegally by holding on to them. And so on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued what I call Emancipation Proclamation 1A. It was in essence a threat. He threatened that unless the Confederacy gave up and the Union took over, that the slaves that were in the Confederacy would be free. He said that if they didn't cease their rebellion by January 1st, 1863, the proclamation to free the slaves would go into effect. So many Confederates were really taken aback by that and believed that Lincoln's proclamation was going to call an all-out slave revolution. So a law was enacted that people call the 20 Negro Law, or the 20, some other word that starts with an N, law. This law allowed any slave owner who had 20 or more slaves to be exempt from having to serve in the Confederacy, and allowed them to be able to stay home so that their wives didn't have to oversee the rebellious slaves, and they could keep their slaves in check. So what happened between those three or so months, from September to January, I call the proclamation and wait. It was Lincoln waiting and his troops waiting to see what was going to happen with the Confederacy, and the Confederacy did not yield. When they didn't yield, Lincoln issued his final proclamation, what I call Emancipation Proclamation 1B, and true to the date, January 1st, 1863, he issued the proclamation that the slaves were, in fact, to be set free. So, wait a minute. General Granger arrived, if you were listening, in Galveston on June 19th, 1865. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. That's like 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Why did it take 2.5 years from the time of the Emancipation Proclamation to the declaration that the slaves were to be set free? Why didn't they know for 2.5 years? Did anyone know? Well, history gives us a lot of stories about why it might have taken so long. Historians have said that maybe it was because slave owners wanted to wait until the harvest was over. History also says that, well, it took a long time for information to reach where it needed to go back in those days. I mean, really, it took 2 months for the Confederate soldiers in western Texas to hear that Robert E. Lee had surrendered. Well, that was 2 months. But 2.5 years? So who did know? Well, the Confederates knew, because they were given that period of time in which they had to do something or not. The Union troops had to have known, because they were supposed to act by January 1st. And slaves were coming over to them, remember? Slaves were coming over to the Union side, so the word had to have been out at least to military heads that Lincoln was giving 3 months for the South to cease their rebellion. Technically, from the Union's perspective, the 250,000 enslaved people in Texas were already free, but no one knew. And no one was in a rush to inform them. Their silence kept the slaves in bondage. Listen to the words of this slave.
Talk to who?
Well, just tell me what your name is.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. That's enough. Well, I couldn't go to nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, that was what we call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me, and I'd have to be back. Whoever he sent me to, they'd give me another pass, and I'd bring that back, so it's to show how long I'd been gone. We couldn't go out and stay an hour or 2 hours or something like that. Just send you. Now, say, for instance, I'd go out to Shirley's place, I'd have to walk, and I'd have to be back maybe in an hour. Maybe they'd give me an hour. I don't know just how long they'd give me. But they'd give me a note so there wasn't nobody interfere with me and tell who I belonged to. And when I come back, why, I'd carry it to my master and give that to him. That'd be all right. But I couldn't just walk away like the people does now, you know. It was what they call, we were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that, have an auction bench, and they put you up on the bench and bid on you, the same as you're bidding on cattle, you know.
Was that in Charlotte that you were a slave? Was that in Charlotte or Charlottesville?
That in Charlottesville.
Charlottesville, Virginia.
Sell the women, sell the men. Oh, and then if they had any bad ones, they'd sell them to the nigger traders, what they call the nigger traders, and they'd ship them down south and sell them down south. But otherwise, if you were a good person, they wouldn't sell you. But if you were bad and mean, they didn't want to beat you and knock you around, they'd sell you to the what they call a nigger trader. They'd have a regular, sale every month, you know, at the courthouse. And then they'd sell you maybe $200, $100, $500.
Were you ever sold from one person to another? Were you ever sold?
No, I never was sold.
You always stayed with the same person?
I was too young to sell.
Oh, I see.
See, I wasn't old enough during the war to sell, during the army. And my father got killed in the army, you know, so it left us small children just to live on whatever people choose to give us. I was bound out for $1 a month, and my mother used to collect the money. Children couldn't spend money when I come along. And, in fact, when I come along, young men couldn't spend no money until they was 21 years old. And then you're 21, well, then you could spend your money. But if you wasn't 21, you couldn't spend no money. I couldn't spend 10 cents if somebody gave it to me. Because they'd think, well, he might have stole it. We all come along, you might say, we had to give an account of what you done. You couldn't just do things and walk off and say, I didn't do it. You'd have to give an account of it. Now, after we got free, then they turned us out like cattle. We didn't have nowhere to go. And we didn't have nobody to boss us. And we didn't know nothing. And there wasn't no school. And when they started the little school, well, people that were slaves, many of them go to school, except they had a father and a mother. And my father was dead, and my mother was living. But she had 3, 4 other little children. She had to put them all to work to help take care of the others. So we had what you call worse than dogs that got it now. The dogs that got it now better than we had it when we come along. I remember one night I was out after I was free, and I didn't have nowhere to go. I didn't have nowhere to sleep. I didn't know what to do. My brother and I was together. So we knew a man that had a livery stable there. And we crept in that yard and got in one of the hacks like an automobile and slept in that hack all night long. So next morning we could get out and go where we belonged. But we were afraid to go at night because we didn't know where to go and didn't know what time to go. But we had got away from there and we were afraid to go back. So we kept slept in that thing all night until the next morning, and we got back where we belonged before the people got up. As soon as day commenced to come break, we got out and commenced to go where we belonged. But we never done that but the one time. After that, we always, if it was away, we'd try to get back before night come. But then that was on a Sunday too, that we done that. Now, when we were slaves, we couldn't do that, you see. And after we got free, we didn't know nothing to do. And my mother, she hunted places and bound us out for $1 a month. And we stayed there maybe a couple of years. And she'd come over and collect the money every month. And $1 was worth more then than $10 is now. And the men used to work for $10 a month, $120 a year, used to hire that way. Now you can't get a man for $50 a month. If you pay a man now $50 a month, you don't want to work for it.
More like $50 a week nowadays.
Well, that's just it exactly. They want $50 a week, and they ain't got no more now. And we had then And we, no more money, but of course they bought more stuff, more property and all like that. We didn't have no property, we didn't have no home. We had nowhere, nothing. We didn't have nothing on it, just like your cattle, we were just turned out and get along the best you could. Nobody to look after us. So we've been slaves all our lives. My mother was a slave, my sister was a slave, father was a slave.
Who was your father a slave for, Uncle Fallon?
He's a slave for Burnley. He belonged to Burnley.
Didn't he belong to Thomas Jefferson at one time?
He didn't belong to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, your grandfather did?
Yeah. And you know what I'd rather do? If I thought, had any idea, that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog.
Can you imagine what it is like to have to wait for freedom? For these slaves, it wasn't 30 months. It was hundreds of years. For a people who didn't deserve one more day of slavery. To me, I would say that 2.5 years of silence, 2.5 years of complicity, 2.5 years of not knowing is cruel and unusual punishment. It's like the 8.4 minutes of wait for Mr. George Floyd. And that wasn't the only silence. According to historian James Smallwood, many slave owners deliberately suppressed that information until after the harvest, and some of them even beyond that. As late as 1868, or 5 years after the Declaration came out, there were reports of enslaved people who didn't find out about their freedom until their slave owners died. And despite the announcement, Texas slave owners, they weren't eager to part with their property, and so some slave owners who were so opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation that their former property were going to be let go, that when freed people started to leave, slave owners beat them, lynched them, or just all out murdered them. They would catch freed slaves swimming across the Sabine River and shoot them. So silence is a scary thing because silence can be used as an affirmation. Silence created an affirmation and an acknowledgement that it was right and appropriate for humans, black humans, to be beaten, to have their children taken away, to be pregnant and lynched and have your baby torn from your body. Silence gave way to those actions. Silence gave rise to strong segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, which were not abolished, believe it or not, until 1968, a century later. These laws restricted when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work and for how much. It required segregated waiting rooms, segregation in buses, segregation on trains, for water fountains, in hospitals, in restrooms, in elevators, in building entrances, in cemeteries, at amusement park cashier windows, in swimming pools, in jails, in residential homes, and, oh yes, from living in white neighborhoods. Silence kept Black Americans from being considered citizens. Birthright citizenship was initially limited to white people. In 1790, the nation's first naturalization law came into effect. It stated that free white persons could gain citizenship if they lived in the U.S. for 2 years and had good character. Black Americans could not. African Americans, after legislation, a fight for legislation, gained the right to citizenship in 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 provided all persons born in the United States, not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians, not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. That is when the birthright citizenship became law. By that time, it had been a few hundred years that African Americans had been and worked in the United States. And it wasn't until the early 50s and 60s that that citizenship was also included the right to vote. The ultimate tragedy, Martin Luther King Jr. said, is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence of the good people. Gandhi said, silence becomes cowardice when occasions demand speaking out the whole truth and acting accordingly. And similarly, Dr. King said, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Silence was the tool imposed to carry out some of the most atrocious deeds to humankind. It's a very painful kind of silence because it removes one's voice, one's spirit, and one's life. It is perhaps why Mr. Floyd cried out, hoping that someone's voice would save his life. I went to a rally last week, and there was a woman there, young white woman, who was wearing a T-shirt. And her T-shirt said, I will no longer be silent. I will not stand by and watch you die. It just hit me. We have followed a lesson of silence. We have stood by in silence, day after day, for hundreds of years, while others have been oppressed and while others have died. And now, right now, it's time for us to gather our courage and to lift the gag order of oppression and to be silent no more. So my challenge with Juneteenth is that I see it more as a day of honor and reflection and remembrance than how other people see it as a day of celebration. I'm grateful for the abolitionists who fought for freedom, black and white. I'm grateful for the slaves who were eventually on a semi-political route toward freedom from bondage. I'm grateful that it was seen that people should not have the privilege to have a God-given right removed from them. However, for me, Juneteenth is a strong reminder that when we are silent, we become partners in the restriction of freedom. When we are silent, we become partners in the perpetual acts of racism. When we are silent, we become partners in the perpetual acts of injustice. When we are silent, we become partners in the perpetual loss of life. To sit silently by, to be a silent bystander is to be morally complicit. It's to be morally complicit in the actual act itself. And so silence is complicit. So if I celebrate anything about Juneteenth, I celebrate the fact that it teaches me of the importance of no longer being silent. It teaches me of the importance of all of us speaking out for justice and for life. So if you'll join me in the affirmation, I will lift the gag order of oppression and I will speak truth. And the denial, I will be silent no more.